The night sky over occupied Europe stretched endless and black, punctured only by the distant flicker of anti-aircraft fire and the pale glow of a crescent moon. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Hartwell gripped the controls of his P-51 Mustang, his leather gloves slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature at 28,000 feet. Below him, somewhere in that impenetrable darkness, lay the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, and with it, the fate of thousands of Allied prisoners of war. But tonight was different from every other mission Jimmy had flown. Tonight, his commanding officer had given him an order that seemed like suicide, an order that went against every instinct a pilot develops in combat, an order that would require him to do the unthinkable, kill his engine over enemy territory. If you're finding this story gripping already, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. What you're about to hear is one of the most incredible untold stories of World War II, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. 3 weeks earlier, Jimmy Hartwell had been sitting in a cramped briefing room at an air base in southern England, surrounded by the familiar smell of cigarette smoke, engine oil, and the nervous energy of young men who knew that any mission could be their last. The winter of 1944 had been brutal, both in weather and in casualties. The 8th Air Force had lost more pilots in the past 6 months than in the previous 2 years combined, and every man in that room knew someone who wasn't coming back. The airbase itself was a testament to the impermanence of war. Hastily constructed on what had once been farmland, it consisted of metal Quonset huts, muddy runways, and rows of aircraft that seemed to multiply overnight. The local village had become accustomed to the roar of engines at all hours, to the sight of young Americans walking down country lanes, to the occasional crash that would send columns of black smoke into the sky. For the pilots, the base had become a strange kind of home. They lived in a state of constant readiness, never knowing when they would be called to fly, never knowing if they would return. They developed rituals and superstitions, ways of coping with the uncertainty. Some carried lucky charms. Others wrote letters home before every mission, just in case. A few had simply stopped thinking about the future altogether, living entirely in the present moment. Jimmy had found his own way of coping. Every evening when his duties were done, he would walk to a small hill at the edge of the base and watch the sunset. There was something calming about the way the sky changed colors, about the way the world continued to be beautiful despite everything that was happening. It reminded him that there would be a future, that the war would end someday, that life would go on. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the front of the room, his silver hair catching the weak light filtering through the windows. Webb was a legend among the pilots, a man who had flown combat missions in the Great War and somehow survived to lead a new generation into battle. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much death, and his eyes held a quality that Jimmy had come to recognize in the most experienced combat veterans. A certain distance, as if part of him was always somewhere else, somewhere beyond the reach of fear or hope. The colonel had a reputation for treating his men fairly, for never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He had flown a handful of missions with them, enough to earn their respect, enough to understand what they faced every time they climbed into a cockpit. But there was also a sadness about him, a weight that he carried that none of them fully understood. "Gentlemen," Webb began, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of command, "what I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. You will not discuss it with your crews, your fellow pilots, or your sweethearts back home. As far as anyone outside this briefing is concerned, this mission does not exist." Jimmy exchanged glances with his wingman, Captain Robert "Bobby" Chen, whose family had emigrated from Canton when he was just a boy. Bobby was the best pilot in the squadron, with reflexes that seemed almost supernatural, and a cool head under fire that had saved Jimmy's life more times than he could count. But even Bobby's composed features showed a flicker of concern at the colonel's words. Webb continued, For the past 18 months, Allied intelligence has been aware of a German research facility located in the Harz Mountains. This facility, codenamed Adlerhorst or Eagle's Nest, has been developing advanced radar systems that could render our bombing campaigns virtually ineffective. We've sent 3 reconnaissance missions to photograph the facility. None of them returned. A murmur rippled through the assembled pilots. 3 missions. That meant at least a dozen men, maybe more, who had disappeared into the German darkness and never come back. The Germans have developed a new type of detection system, Webb explained, pointing to a map on the wall. It can track our aircraft from nearly 200 miles away, giving them ample time to scramble fighters and position their anti-aircraft batteries. Every approach we've tried has resulted in the same outcome. Our boys get picked up on their scopes long before they reach the target, and by the time they arrive, the welcome committee is waiting for them. Jimmy felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had heard rumors about German radar advances, whispered conversations in the officers' club about missions that had gone wrong in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Formations that had been ambushed despite taking every precaution, escort fighters that had found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by enemies who seemed to know exactly where they would be. However, Webb said, and his voice took on a different quality now, something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. We have recently acquired intelligence that suggests a possible solution. A way to approach the facility undetected. He paused, and Jimmy could see that whatever came next was something the colonel himself found difficult to believe. The German radar system has one critical weakness, Webb continued. It tracks aircraft based on the electromagnetic signature produced by their engines, specifically the ignition systems. If you cut your engine completely, you become invisible to their scopes. The room erupted in disbelief. Cut our engines? Over enemy territory? That's insane. The protests came from every corner, but Jimmy noticed that Bobby remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on the colonel with an intensity that suggested he was already calculating the possibilities. Webb held up his hand for silence. I know what you're thinking, and you're right. It sounds like a death sentence, but the mathematics have been worked out by our best engineers. A P-51 at optimal altitude can glide for approximately 40 miles with its engine completely shut down. That's enough to penetrate the radar coverage, photograph the facility, and reach a safe distance before you need to restart. And if the engine doesn't restart, someone asked from the back of the room. Then you're a very long way from home, with no power and no options, Webb replied bluntly. I won't lie to you, gentlemen. This mission is voluntary only. No man will be ordered to attempt it, and no mark will go against anyone who declines. But I will tell you this. If we don't find a way to neutralize that facility, the losses we've suffered so far will look like a pleasant memory compared to what's coming. The briefing room fell silent. Jimmy looked around at the faces of his fellow pilots, young men who had already sacrificed so much, who had watched friends die in burning aircraft and still climb back into their cockpits day after day. He thought about his younger brother, David, who was somewhere in the Pacific flying torpedo bombers off aircraft carriers. He thought about his parents back in Ohio, who checked the mail every day with a mixture of hope and dread. He thought about Sarah, the English nurse he had met at a dance in London, whose letters kept him going through the darkest nights. And then he raised his hand. Bobby's hand went up a moment later, followed by 3 more pilots, whose names Jimmy knew, but whose faces seemed to blur together in that moment. 5 volunteers for what might well be a one-way trip into the heart of enemy territory. Colonel Webb nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Very well, gentlemen. Training begins at 0600 tomorrow. Dismissed. The next 3 weeks were unlike anything Jimmy had experienced since flight school. Under the supervision of a team of engineers and test pilots, he learned the delicate art of engine-off flight, discovering that a P-51 without power was a very different beast from the responsive, powerful machine he had come to know. Every decision had to be calculated in advance, every altitude change weighed against the precious resource of potential energy. A wrong move meant losing too much height too quickly, and in enemy territory, altitude was life. The lead engineer on the project was a thin, bespectacled man named Dr. Harold Steinberg, a refugee from Austria who had fled the Nazi regime in 1938. Steinberg had been one of Europe's foremost aeronautical engineers before the war, and he brought to the project a combination of technical brilliance and personal motivation that drove the team to work around the clock. "You must understand," Steinberg told the pilots during one of their briefings, his accent still thick despite years in America. "What we are asking you to do is theoretically possible, but practically untested. The mathematics tell us it can work. But mathematics cannot account for wind shear, for temperature inversions, for the thousand small variables that can turn a successful glide into a death spiral." He paused, removing his glasses and polishing them with his handkerchief. "I lost my parents to the camps," he continued quietly, "my sisters, my uncles and aunts and cousins, an entire family erased from the face of the earth. What you are doing, what we are all doing together, it may not bring them back. But it may prevent others from sharing their fate. That is why I work. That is why I do not sleep. That is why I will not stop until we have given you every advantage possible." The training took place over the North Sea, far from prying eyes and possible German agents. Day after day, Jimmy would climb to maximum altitude, cut his engine, and practice the long, silent glide that might one day save his life or end it. He learned to read the air currents, to feel the subtle shifts in pressure that could mean the difference between reaching his objective and falling short. He learned to trust his instruments in ways he never had before, because without the reassuring roar of the Merlin engine, the cockpit became a place of eerie silence where only the wind and his own heartbeat kept him company. The physical demands of the training were immense. Flying at high altitude without engine heat meant enduring temperatures that could drop to 50 degrees below zero. The pilots wore multiple layers of insulated clothing, but even so, the cold seeped through, numbing fingers and toes, making every movement an act of will. They learned to manage their oxygen carefully, knowing that at altitude, even a small miscalculation could lead to hypoxia and unconsciousness. One day, during a particularly difficult training flight, Jimmy experienced a moment of pure terror that would stay with him forever. He had cut his engine at 30,000 feet and was settling into the glide when he felt the aircraft begin to shudder. For a moment, he thought he had entered a stall, that he had misjudged his speed and was about to fall out of the sky. But then he realized what was happening. He had flown into an area of severe turbulence, invisible waves of air that were tossing his powerless aircraft like a leaf in a storm. Without the engine to help him recover, he was at the mercy of forces he couldn't see or predict. The next few minutes were the longest of his life. Jimmy wrestled with the controls, trying to find a path through the turbulence, trying to maintain enough airspeed to keep flying. The altimeter wound down at an alarming rate, each 1,000 feet, a reminder of how little margin he had left. Finally, he broke through into calmer air, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the stick. He restarted the engine with trembling fingers, feeling the surge of power that meant he was going to live. When he landed, Dr. Steinberg was waiting for him on the tarmac, his face pale with concern. "What happened up there?" Steinberg asked. Jimmy told him about the turbulence, about the terrifying minutes when he had been completely at the mercy of the elements. Steinberg nodded slowly. "This is what we feared," he said. "The mathematics cannot predict everything. There will be moments when you must rely on instinct alone, on the bond between pilot and aircraft that goes beyond calculation." He placed a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. You survived because you did not panic, because you trusted your training and your skills. Remember that when you fly over Germany. Remember that no matter what happens, you have the ability to find a way through. The other pilots had similar experiences during the training period. Bobby Chen had an engine restart failure that forced him to bail out over the North Sea, spending 2 hours in freezing water before a rescue boat could reach him. The experience left him with a deep cough that would plague him for weeks, but it also gave him an intimate understanding of what it meant to truly be alone and helpless. The training pushed them all to their limits and beyond. By the time it was over, they had developed a bond that went deeper than friendship. They had faced death together, had trusted each other with their lives, had learned to communicate without words. They were no longer just pilots. They were something more, a single organism composed of 5 separate parts, each one essential to the survival of the whole. Bobby proved to be even more adept at the technique than Jimmy, which surprised no one. What did surprise Jimmy was how the usually reserved pilot began to open up during those long hours of training. One evening, as they sat in the empty mess hall nursing cups of lukewarm coffee, Bobby told Jimmy about his family. "My father came to America with nothing," Bobby said, his voice quiet but steady. "He worked in a laundry in San Francisco, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. People called him names, threw rocks at him, told him to go back where he came from. But he never complained. He used to say that America was like a promise that hadn't been kept yet. But that didn't mean it wouldn't be." Jimmy nodded, not knowing what to say. He'd grown up in a small town in Ohio where everyone looked more or less like him, where the biggest controversy was whether the high school football team would beat their rivals from the next county over. Bobby's America was a different country entirely, one that Jimmy was only beginning to understand. "When the war started," Bobby continued, "some people thought my family might be spies. Can you imagine? My father had lived in America for 30 years, paid his taxes, raised his children to be good citizens, and still some people looked at him and saw the enemy. Is that why you volunteered for this mission?" Jimmy asked. Bobby smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually serious face. "Partly, but mostly I volunteered because I believe that what we're doing matters, not just for America, but for everyone. If the Nazis win, it won't just be bad for Jews or Poles or anyone else they've decided to hate this week. It'll be bad for everyone who believes that human beings deserve to be treated with dignity, including people who look like me." They sat in silence for a while after that, each lost in his own thoughts. Jimmy thought about the German soldiers he had seen in reconnaissance photographs, young men not so different from himself, who had been taught to believe in a monstrous ideology. He thought about the concentration camps that intelligence reports had begun to describe, places of systematic horror that seemed too evil to be real. And he thought about the mission that lay ahead, the impossible task of flying into the heart of darkness to bring back the information that might turn the tide of the war. The day before the mission, Colonel Webb called the 5 volunteers into his office, one by one. When Jimmy's turn came, he found the old man standing by the window, staring out at the grey English sky. "Lieutenant Hartwell," Webb said without turning around, "do you know why I chose to lead this squadron?" "No, sir," Jimmy replied. "Because I lost my son in this war," Webb said quietly. "Thomas. He was a bomber pilot, shot down over Hamburg 2 years ago. They told me his aircraft went down in flames, that there was no chance anyone survived. But I never saw a body, never got to say goodbye." Jimmy didn't know how to respond. He had never heard the colonel speak about anything personal before. "I'm telling you this," Webb continued, finally turning to face Jimmy, "because I want you to understand something. This mission isn't about revenge or glory or any of the things that young men sometimes think war is about. It's about giving other fathers the chance to see their sons come home. It's about ending this nightmare so that the next generation won't have to fight it all over again." "I understand, sir," Jimmy said, and he meant it. Webb nodded slowly. "I believe you do. Now get some rest. You've got a long flight ahead of you." But Jimmy couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the airbase, the distant rumble of engines being tested, the muffled voices of ground crew working through the night, the occasional bark of a dog from somewhere in the darkness. He thought about all the things he had left unsaid, all the moments he had taken for granted, all the possibilities that might never come to pass. At some point, he must have drifted off, because the next thing he knew, Bobby was shaking him awake. It was still dark outside, but the eastern horizon showed the faintest hint of grey. "It's time," Bobby said simply. They gathered in the briefing room one last time. 5 pilots who had become closer than brothers over the past 3 weeks. Colonel Webb went over the mission parameters one final time. The approach route, the altitude requirements, the exact moment when they would need to cut their engines, the window of time they had to complete their objectives before the German defenses caught up with them. He spoke with the calm precision of a man who had given countless such briefings, but Jimmy could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the pointer, just a little too tightly. "Gentlemen," Webb concluded, "in a few hours you will do something that no pilots in history have ever attempted. You will fly into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe without the power of your engines to protect you. You will trust in physics, in your training, and in each other. And if God is willing, you will come back with the information we need to win this war." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Whatever happens today, know that your country is proud of you. That I am proud of you. Now go out there and show those Nazi bastards what American pilots are made of." The takeoff was routine, or as routine as anything could be when you were flying toward almost certain death. Jimmy's P-51, which he had named Sarah's Angel, after the woman who wrote him letters every week, climbed smoothly into the pre-dawn sky. He formed up with the others, and together they turned east toward the rising sun and the enemy beyond. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Jimmy found himself thinking about all the things that had brought him to this moment. He thought about his childhood in Ohio, about summer days spent fishing in the creek behind his house, about autumn evenings watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. He thought about his mother's apple pie, about his father's calloused hands, about the way his little brother used to follow him everywhere. He thought about the day he had first seen an airplane, a barnstormer who had landed in a field outside of town and offered rides for $1. His father had scraped together the money, and Jimmy had climbed into that rickety biplane with his heart pounding and his palms sweating. The moment the wheels left the ground, he had known that this was what he was meant to do, that the sky was his true home. He thought about flight school, about the grueling hours of training that had transformed him from a farm boy into a warrior. He thought about his first combat mission, about the terror and exhilaration of aerial combat, about the first time he had seen a friend die in a burning aircraft. And he thought about Sarah, about the night they had met at a dance in London, about the way she had smiled at him across the crowded room. She had been wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes, and when they danced, he had felt something shift inside him, as if his heart had finally found its proper place. He had kissed her that night, standing under the stars in a bombed-out square, surrounded by the wreckage of a civilization trying to destroy itself. And in that kiss, he had found a reason to survive, a reason to keep fighting, a reason to believe that the future might hold something more than death and destruction. Now, flying toward that uncertain future, Jimmy made himself a promise. If he survived this mission, if he made it back to England, he would find Sarah and tell her that he loved her. He would ask her to marry him, to build a life with him, to help him forget the horrors he had witnessed. It was a simple promise, perhaps naive in its hopefulness, but it was enough to keep him going. enough to steady his hands on the controls, enough to push back the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. The first hour of the flight was almost peaceful. They climbed steadily, passing through scattered clouds, watching the English Channel give way to the occupied coastline of France. Jimmy kept his eyes moving constantly, scanning for enemy fighters, but the sky remained empty. Whatever the Germans knew or didn't know, they hadn't sent anyone to intercept them yet. The landscape below them changed as they flew deeper into enemy territory. The patchwork of French farms gave way to the darker forests of Germany, and Jimmy could see the scars of war etched into the earth. Bomb craters, burned-out villages, roads clogged with military vehicles. He thought about the people living down there, the ordinary Germans who had nothing to do with the madness of their leaders. Some of them were surely innocent, caught up in a war they had never wanted. Others were complicit, having chosen to look away while their neighbors were dragged off to the camps. And some, he knew, were actively evil, willing participants in the greatest crime in human history. War had a way of stripping away the comforting illusions of peacetime. It revealed the true nature of humanity, the capacity for both heroism and depravity that lurked beneath the surface of civilization. Jimmy had seen things that would haunt him forever, things that no human being should ever have to witness, but he had also seen acts of courage and compassion that restored his faith in the fundamental goodness of people. As they crossed into German airspace, the tension in the cockpit became almost physical. Jimmy could feel it in his shoulders, in the way his hands gripped the controls, in the rapid beating of his heart. This was the moment they had trained for, the point of no return. Bobby's voice crackled over the radio. Eagle Leader to Eagle Flight, approaching cut-off point. Altitude 29,000 feet. Confirm status. One by one, the other pilots reported in. All systems nominal. All engines running smoothly. All pilots ready for what came next. Eagle Flight, Bobby said, his voice steady as a rock. Prepare to cut engines on my mark. Jimmy took a deep breath. He thought about his parents, about Sarah, about all the people who were counting on him. He thought about the men who had tried this mission before and never come back, and then he cleared his mind of everything except the task at hand. Mark. Jimmy reached for the ignition switch and pulled. The Merlin engine coughed once, twice, and then fell silent. The sudden absence of noise was almost overwhelming, like stepping into a cathedral after walking through a busy street. The vibration that had become so familiar over hundreds of hours of flight simply vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to swallow everything. For a moment, Jimmy felt panic rising in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to restart the engine, to feel the reassuring roar of power that had kept him alive through dozens of combat missions. But he forced himself to stay calm, to trust the physics that the engineers had explained so carefully. The P-51 began to glide, its nose dipping slightly as it traded altitude for forward momentum. Jimmy adjusted the trim, finding the optimal angle for maximum range. According to his calculations, he had about 40 minutes of glide time before he would need to restart the engine, and the target was approximately 35 minutes away. It was going to be close, very close. The silence of engine-off flight was unlike anything Jimmy had ever experienced. He could hear the wind rushing past his canopy, could hear the creak of the aircraft's structure as it flexed and settled into the glide. He could hear his own breathing, loud and harsh in the oxygen mask. And beneath it all, he could hear the whisper of mortality, the soft voice that reminded him how fragile human life was in this vast, indifferent sky. Minutes passed. The altimeter wound down slowly but steadily, each 1,000 feet representing another step closer to the Earth, another moment of irretrievable potential energy. Jimmy watched the German countryside pass beneath him, a patchwork of fields and forests and small towns that would have looked peaceful if not for the context. Eagle Leader to Eagle Flight, Bobby's voice came over the radio, barely more than a whisper. I have visual on the target, bearing 270, approximately 15 miles. Jimmy looked in the direction Bobby indicated and felt his breath catch in his throat. There, nestled in a valley between two forested mountains, was the Adlerhorst facility. It was larger than the intelligence photographs had suggested, a sprawling complex of buildings and antenna arrays that bristled against the morning sky like the spines of some mechanical porcupine. And it was heavily defended. Even from this distance, Jimmy could see the anti-aircraft batteries positioned around the perimeter, the radar dishes that swept the sky like mechanical eyes. If those defenses knew they were coming, if the plan had failed somehow, they would be sitting ducks, powerless aircraft drifting down from the sky like leaves in autumn. But the defenses remained silent. The radar dishes continued their steady rotation, detecting nothing. The anti-aircraft guns pointed at empty sky, waiting for enemies who, as far as they knew, did not exist. It was working. The impossible plan was actually working. Jimmy activated his reconnaissance camera, feeling the slight vibration as it began to capture images of the facility below. He adjusted his glide path, trading a few precious feet of altitude for a better angle, and watched as the complex filled his viewfinder. Eagle 2, beginning my run, Jimmy reported, keeping his voice low even though he knew the Germans couldn't hear him. Copy, Eagle 2, Bobby replied. Eagle 3 and 4, prepare for your runs. Eagle 5, maintain overwatch. They worked quickly and efficiently, each pilot making a single pass over the facility before pulling away to make room for the next. The cameras whirred and clicked, capturing images that would be analyzed by intelligence officers back in England, images that might reveal the secrets of German radar technology and provide the key to neutralizing the threat. Jimmy was on his second pass when everything went wrong. He felt it before he heard it, a sudden shudder that ran through his aircraft like a living thing. For a moment, he thought he had been hit, that somehow the German defenses had detected them, despite all their precautions. But then he saw the cause, a massive storm front rolling in from the northwest, its leading edge a wall of turbulent air that caught his gliding aircraft like a leaf in a hurricane. Eagle Flight, Bobby's voice came over the radio, suddenly urgent. We have weather incoming. Recommend immediate engine restart and emergency extraction. But Jimmy knew that restarting the engine now would light them up on German radar like a Christmas tree. They had come too far, risked too much to fail at the last moment. He made a decision that would either save the mission or kill him. Eagle 2, continuing run, Jimmy reported. I can make it. He heard Bobby start to protest, but he was already committed, diving into the turbulent air with nothing but momentum and desperate skill to keep him aloft. The aircraft bucked and shuddered, fighting him at every turn, but Jimmy held on, wrestling with the controls, forcing the P-51 to obey his will through sheer determination. The facility passed beneath him one final time, and he felt the camera capturing the last crucial images. Then he was through, out the other side of the turbulence, his altitude dangerously low, but his aircraft still intact. Now came the moment of truth. Jimmy reached for the engine starter, his hand trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He pulled the primer, flipped the magneto switches, and pressed the starter button. Nothing happened. He tried again, going through the procedure exactly as he had been trained, exactly as he had done 1,000 times before. The engine turned over once, twice, coughed, and died. Jimmy's heart stopped. He was at 12,000 feet, still over enemy territory, with a dead engine and no way to reach friendly lines. The ground was coming up fast, and with it, the certain knowledge that his war was about to end. Eagle 2, Bobby's voice crackled over the radio. Status report. Engine won't start, Jimmy replied, surprised at how calm his own voice sounded. I'm going down. There was silence on the radio for a long moment. Then Bobby spoke again, and his voice held a quality that Jimmy had never heard before, a fierce determination that seemed to burn through the static. "Negative, Eagle 2. You are not going down. Try again. Fuel mixture full rich. Throttle cracked 1 inch. Now." Jimmy followed the instructions automatically, his hands moving even as his mind screamed that it was hopeless, that he had done everything right and the engine simply wouldn't start. He pressed the starter button one more time, praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Jimmy had never heard a more beautiful sound. He pulled back on the stick, feeling the aircraft respond, feeling the power surge through the airframe as the Merlin engine clawed for altitude. The ground that had been rushing up to meet him fell away, replaced by the limitless sky. "Eagle 2 is back in business," Jimmy reported, his voice cracking with relief, proceeding to extraction point. The flight home was a blur of exhaustion and elation. They had done it. They had penetrated the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, photographed a facility that had destroyed every previous mission sent against it, and escaped without firing a shot. The intelligence they had gathered would change the course of the war, would save countless lives, would bring the end just a little bit closer. But the cost would become clear soon enough. 3 days after the mission, the intelligence analysts had completed their initial assessment of the photographs. The results were better than anyone had hoped. The images revealed not only the layout of the Adlerhorst facility, but also critical details about the radar system itself, information that would allow Allied engineers to develop countermeasures. Within weeks, bombing missions that had previously suffered catastrophic losses were returning with their formations intact. The German early warning system that had seemed invincible was suddenly blind, unable to detect the waves of Allied aircraft that poured over the Reich day and night. The tide of the war, which had seemed to be shifting in Germany's favor, began to turn decisively toward the Allies. But for Jimmy and the other pilots of Eagle Flight, there was little time to celebrate. The success of their mission had caught the attention of the highest levels of command, and soon they found themselves being prepared for an even more dangerous assignment. It was Colonel Webb who delivered the news, calling them into his office on a grey March afternoon, when the rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, and the airbase felt more like a prison than a home. "Gentlemen," Webb began, "what you accomplished over Adlerhorst was nothing short of miraculous. You proved that the impossible is sometimes possible, that courage and skill can overcome even the most formidable defenses. And now your country needs you to do it again." He pulled down a map that had been hanging on the wall behind him, revealing a detailed chart of Central Europe. A red circle had been drawn around a location deep in occupied Poland, near a town with a name that none of them recognized. "This is Auschwitz," Webb said quietly. "Perhaps you've heard rumors about what's happening there. I can tell you that those rumors don't begin to capture the reality. What the Germans are doing in that place is beyond anything that civilized nations have ever witnessed. They are systematically murdering innocent people by the tens of thousands, men, women, and children, for no reason other than their religion or ethnicity." Jimmy felt his stomach turn. He had heard whispers about the concentration camps, had seen the intelligence reports that described conditions too horrible to believe. But he had never allowed himself to fully accept the reality, had pushed it to the back of his mind where it couldn't interfere with the daily business of survival. "The primary gas chambers and crematoria are located here," Webb continued, pointing to a spot on the map. "Intelligence estimates that they are capable of murdering up to 10,000 people per day. Every day that those facilities remain operational, thousands of innocent lives are lost." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with emotion. "There has been considerable debate at the highest levels about whether to attempt a bombing mission against the camp. Some argue that the risk of killing prisoners is too high, that we would be doing the Germans' work for them. Others argue that we have a moral obligation to try, that doing nothing makes us complicit in the slaughter. "What has been decided, sir?" Bobby asked. "A compromise," Webb replied. "We are not going to bomb the camp itself, but we are going to destroy the railway lines that bring the victims to their deaths. Without those rail connections, the Germans will be unable to continue their operations at the current scale. It won't stop the killing entirely, but it will save lives, perhaps many lives." Jimmy understood immediately what was being asked. The railway lines were deep in occupied Poland, far beyond the range of normal escort fighters. The only way to reach them would be to use the same technique they had employed over Adlerhorst, cutting their engines and gliding silently over enemy territory. But this mission would be different. The target was hundreds of miles farther than the previous one, requiring them to push the limits of their aircraft and their own endurance. And unlike the reconnaissance mission over Adlerhorst, this time they would have to restart their engines over the target and attack the railway lines while German fighters and anti-aircraft batteries scrambled to respond. It was, in every sense, a suicide mission. "When do we leave?" Jimmy heard himself say. Webb looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Then the colonel nodded slowly. 3 days. "We're waiting for a weather window. In the meantime, I suggest you get your affairs in order." The days that followed were some of the strangest of Jimmy's life. He wrote letters to his parents, to Sarah, to friends he hadn't spoken to in years. He walked the perimeter of the airbase at night, looking up at the stars and wondering if they would still be there when he was gone. He spent hours with Bobby, talking about everything and nothing, building a friendship that both of them knew might end at any moment. On the second night, he found Bobby sitting alone in the chapel, a small wooden building that had been converted from a storage shed when the airbase was first established. Bobby wasn't praying exactly. He was just sitting there staring at the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. "Didn't know you were religious," Jimmy said, sliding into the pew beside him. "I'm not really," Bobby replied. "My family practiced a kind of blend of Buddhism and Christianity, never quite one or the other. But I find places like this peaceful, like they exist outside of time somehow." Jimmy nodded. He understood what Bobby meant. In the chaos of war, there was something comforting about a space that was dedicated to something larger than the immediate struggle for survival. "Can I tell you something?" Bobby asked. "Anything?" "I'm scared," Bobby said simply. "Not of dying, exactly. I came to terms with that possibility a long time ago. What scares me is the thought that all of this might be for nothing, that we might fail, and the killing will continue, and 100 years from now no one will remember that we tried." Jimmy thought about that for a moment. Then he said something that surprised both of them. "My grandfather fought in the Civil War. He was just a kid, barely older than us, when he marched off to fight for the Union. He never talked about the war much, but there was one story he told me before he died, about a battle where his regiment was ordered to hold a hill against a Confederate assault. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and everyone knew they couldn't win. But they held that hill anyway, not because they thought they would survive, but because holding it gave the rest of the army time to retreat and regroup." He paused, gathering his thoughts. When I asked him why he did it, why he was willing to die for a few hours of time, he said something I've never forgotten. He said that sometimes the value of an action isn't in whether it succeeds. Sometimes the value is in the trying, in showing that there are still people willing to stand up against evil, even when the odds are impossible. Bobby was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, that rare expression that transformed his face. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was," Jimmy agreed. "He was." The morning of the mission arrived with clear skies and a cold wind from the east. Jimmy climbed into the cockpit of Sarah's Angel, feeling strangely calm, as if he had already made peace with whatever was going to happen. He ran through his pre-flight checks with methodical precision, every movement practiced and automatic, while his mind floated somewhere above it all, watching from a distance. They took off at dawn, 5 aircraft climbing into a sky that seemed to go on forever. The English countryside fell away beneath them, green and peaceful, and Jimmy thought about all the people down there who had no idea what was happening, who were going about their ordinary lives while young men flew off to die on their behalf. The flight across occupied Europe was long and tense. They flew high above the scattered clouds, conserving fuel and altitude for the mission ahead. Jimmy watched the landscape change beneath him, from the fields of France to the forests of Germany to the plains of Poland, each mile bringing them closer to their objective and further from any hope of rescue. 5 hours into the flight, Bobby's voice came over the radio. Eagle flight approaching cutoff point, altitude 31,000 feet. This is it, gentlemen. May God be with us all. One by one, they cut their engines. The silence descended like a shroud, and Jimmy felt the familiar sensation of gliding through empty air, trusting in physics and training to keep him aloft. But this time, there was no comfort in the silence. This time, he knew that when the engines came back on, they would be announcing their presence to every German fighter within 100 miles. The railway junction appeared on the horizon, a spiderweb of tracks converging on a small town that the intelligence briefings had identified as a major transit point for deportation trains. Even from altitude, Jimmy could see the trains lined up on the sidings, dozens of cattle cars waiting to transport their human cargo to the death camps. Eagle flight, Bobby said, beginning attack run. Restart engines on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. Jimmy pulled the engine starter and felt the Merlin roar back to life. In an instant, the silence was shattered, replaced by the familiar thunder of a warplane preparing for combat. He pushed the throttle forward, diving toward the target, watching the railway junction grow larger in his windscreen. The Germans reacted faster than expected. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from hidden positions around the junction, black bursts of flak that filled the sky with deadly shrapnel. Jimmy felt his aircraft shudder as a near miss sent fragments rattling against the fuselage, but he held his course, his finger tightening on the trigger. He opened fire at 500 feet, his 6 machine guns sending streams of tracers into the railway tracks below. He saw the impact, saw the rails twist and buckle under the onslaught, saw a locomotive explode in a fireball that momentarily blinded him. Then he was through, pulling up hard, fighting for altitude as the German defenses tried desperately to bring him down. Behind him, he heard the other pilots making their runs, heard the chatter of machine guns and the crump of explosions. He heard Bobby calling out targets, coordinating the attack with the calm precision that had made him the best pilot in the squadron. And he heard something else, a sound that made his blood run cold. Eagle 5 is hit. Eagle 5 is going down. Jimmy banked hard, searching for the stricken aircraft. He found it almost immediately, trailing smoke and fire, spiraling toward the ground with the terrible inevitability of a dying bird. The pilot, a young man from Nebraska named Tom Reeves, was fighting the controls, trying desperately to regain control of his shattered aircraft. For a moment, Jimmy considered going back. He could provide cover, give Tom a chance to bail out, maybe even escort him to friendly territory if the aircraft held together long enough. But he knew it was hopeless. Tom was too low, too badly damaged, too far from any chance of rescue. "Go!" Tom's voice came over the radio, surprisingly calm. "Complete the mission. I'll be fine." They both knew it was a lie, but it was a lie that gave the others permission to do what they had to do. Jimmy turned away, his vision blurring with tears he couldn't afford to shed. He fell back into formation with the remaining aircraft, and together they made one final pass over the railway junction, leaving it a tangled wreck of twisted metal and burning wreckage. The flight home was a nightmare. German fighters caught up with them over central Germany, a swarm of Messerschmitts that fell on them like wolves on wounded prey. The battle that followed was a blur of violence and desperation, of diving and climbing and shooting and praying. Jimmy emptied his ammunition into an enemy fighter that was lining up on Bobby's tail, watched it explode in a fireball, felt no satisfaction in the kill. The Messerschmitts were relentless. For every one they shot down, two more seemed to appear. The sky was filled with tracer fire and smoke and the debris of shattered aircraft. Jimmy heard the radio chatter of his fellow pilots, the calm voices reporting damage and casualties, the occasional scream that was cut short by static. At one point, a German fighter locked onto Jimmy's tail, and he could hear the bullets punching into his aircraft. He threw the P-51 into a steep dive, pulling more Gs than he had ever attempted, feeling the blood drain from his head as the world narrowed to a tunnel of grey. He came out of the dive just above the treetops, the Messerschmitt still behind him, still firing. Then Bobby was there, appearing out of nowhere, his guns blazing. The German fighter exploded, showering Jimmy's canopy with debris and fuel. Bobby pulled alongside, close enough that Jimmy could see his face through the cockpit, and gave a thumbs up. They flew on, pushing their damaged aircraft to the limit, running on fumes and adrenaline. The English Channel appeared on the horizon like a promise of salvation, and Jimmy felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the moment they cut their engines over Germany. When they finally crossed the English Channel, only 3 aircraft remained of the original 5. 2 pilots had been lost over Poland, their sacrifice the price of the mission's success. The landing was rough. Jimmy's aircraft had taken more damage than he realized, and one of his landing gear refused to extend. He had to bring it in on one wheel, and his belly, grinding along the runway in a shower of sparks, feeling the aircraft shudder and groan as it slid to a stop. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment after the aircraft stopped moving, too exhausted to climb out, too overwhelmed to think. Ground crew swarmed around him, pulling open the canopy, helping him out of his harness. He was aware of voices, of hands supporting him, but none of it seemed real. Colonel Webb was waiting for them on the tarmac when they landed. His face was grey and drawn, but there was something in his eyes that might have been pride. "You did it," he said simply. "The railway lines are destroyed. Intelligence estimates that deportations will be delayed by at least 2 weeks while they make repairs. That's 2 weeks of lives saved. Thousands of people who will live because of what you did today." Jimmy nodded, unable to speak. He thought about Tom Reeves, about the other pilot whose name he couldn't even remember in that moment, about all the lives that had been traded for those 2 weeks of delay. Was it worth it? Would it ever be worth it? He didn't know. He might never know. But as he walked away from his aircraft, as the adrenaline faded and the weight of exhaustion settled over him, he found himself remembering his grandfather's words. Sometimes the value of an action isn't in whether it succeeds. Sometimes the value is in the trying. The weeks that followed brought news that confirmed the mission's impact. The deportation trains that had been scheduled to arrive at Auschwitz during the repair period never came. Thousands of people who had been marked for death were given a reprieve, a few extra weeks or months of life that might, in some cases, be enough to see them through to liberation. But the war was far from over, and there was no time to celebrate. The Allied forces were pushing toward Germany from all directions, and the desperate final act of the conflict was just beginning. Jimmy flew more missions that spring, escort duties and ground attacks and reconnaissance flights that blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and fear. He watched friends die and made new friends to replace them, knowing that they too might be gone tomorrow. He received letters from Sarah, beautiful letters full of hope and love, and he treasured each one like a sacred artifact. In late April, the news came that everyone had been waiting for. The concentration camps were being liberated. Allied forces had reached Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and dozens of other sites of horror. and the world was finally seeing the full extent of what had been done. Jimmy was in the officers' club when the photographs were posted on the bulletin board. He stood there for a long time, staring at images of skeletal survivors and piles of corpses, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the evil that had been committed. And he thought about the railway mission, about the lives they had saved by those 2 weeks of delay, and he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't enough, it could never be enough, but it was something. It was proof that in the face of absolute evil, there were still people willing to fight back. Bobby found him there an hour later, still staring at the photographs. "I've been thinking," Bobby said quietly, "about what we did, about whether it mattered." "And?" Jimmy asked. "I think my father was right," Bobby replied. "America is like a promise that hasn't been kept yet, but promises don't keep themselves. People keep them, one action at a time, one sacrifice at a time. What we did over Poland, that was part of keeping the promise, maybe a small part in the grand scheme of things, but a part nonetheless." Jimmy nodded slowly. He understood what Bobby meant. The war had shown him things about human nature that he would never forget, both the capacity for unimaginable cruelty and the capacity for extraordinary courage, and he had learned that the choice between them was made not in grand gestures, but in small moments, in decisions that no one else might ever know about, in the willingness to do the right thing even when the cost was unbearable. The war in Europe ended 2 weeks later. Jimmy was on the tarmac, preparing for another mission, when the announcement came over the loudspeaker. He stood there in the sudden silence, not quite believing it was real, watching as men all around him began to cheer and embrace and weep with relief. Bobby appeared beside him, his face split in an uncharacteristic grin. "We made it," Bobby said. "We actually made it." Jimmy shook his hand, then pulled him into a hug. They had made it. Against all odds, against all the probabilities, they had survived. In the days that followed, Jimmy learned the full scope of what the engine-off missions had accomplished. The intelligence gathered over Adlerhorst had led to the development of radar countermeasures that had saved an estimated 10,000 Allied airmen. The railway attacks had disrupted deportations, not just from Poland, but from across occupied Europe, as the techniques pioneered by Eagle Flight were adopted by other squadrons and applied to targets throughout the Reich. None of this had been revealed during the war, for obvious reasons. But now, with the fighting over, the story could finally be told. And it was a story that would change how people thought about air combat, about intelligence gathering, and about the moral imperatives of war. Jimmy stayed in the military after the war ended, not because he loved fighting, but because he felt an obligation to pass on what he had learned. He became an instructor at the Air Force Academy, teaching young pilots the skills and the mindset they would need to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Bobby went back to San Francisco, where he started a business building radios and eventually helped pioneer the emerging field of commercial aviation electronics. His company became one of the most successful in the industry, and he used his wealth to fund scholarships for Asian American students who wanted to pursue careers in engineering and science. They stayed in touch over the years, exchanging letters and occasional visits, their friendship deepened by the shared experience of having faced death together and survived. And every year, on the anniversary of the Adlerhorst mission, they would call each other just to hear a familiar voice, just to remember. Colonel Webb died in 1952, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, a young woman approached Jimmy, and it took him a moment to recognize her as the daughter Webb had never mentioned, the sister of the son he had lost over Hamburg. She pressed something into Jimmy's hand, a photograph of Webb and his son taken before the war, both of them smiling with a joy that the world would soon take away. "He talked about you," she said. "About all of you. He said you were the bravest men he ever knew." Jimmy couldn't speak. He just nodded and slipped the photograph into his pocket, where he would carry it for the rest of his life. Sarah and Jimmy were married in 1946 in a small church in her hometown in England. They had 3 children and 6 grandchildren, and Jimmy never stopped being amazed by the ordinary miracle of a life lived in peace. Every morning, when he woke up next to the woman he loved, in a world where the sound of aircraft engines meant commerce rather than destruction, he remembered how close he had come to losing it all. He never forgot the men who hadn't been as lucky, the pilots who had died over Adlerhorst and Poland, and all the other targets whose names had faded from memory. He kept their photographs in a box in his study, and sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, he would take them out and look at their young faces and wonder what they might have become. In 1975, 30 years after the end of the war, Jimmy received an invitation to a ceremony in Israel. The country was honoring the men who had participated in the railway attacks, recognizing their contribution to saving Jewish lives during the Holocaust. Jimmy almost didn't go, uncomfortable with the idea of being celebrated for something that had cost so many lives. But Bobby convinced him, pointing out that the ceremony wasn't really about them, but about the people they had helped to save. The ceremony was held at a memorial in Jerusalem, under a sky so blue it seemed to belong to another world. Jimmy stood with the other aging veterans, listening to speeches in languages he didn't understand, watching as survivors and their descendants placed flowers on the memorial. And then something happened that he would remember for the rest of his life. A woman approached him, her face weathered by time and suffering, her eyes holding a depth of experience that no words could capture. She was accompanied by a young man, perhaps in his 20s, who looked at Jimmy with an expression of nervous anticipation. "You are Lieutenant Hartwell?" the woman asked in accented English. "I was," Jimmy replied. "A long time ago." The woman reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I was on one of the trains," she said, "in 1944. We were supposed to go to Auschwitz, but the trains stopped. They told us the tracks were destroyed. We waited for 2 weeks in a holding camp while they fixed them." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "In those 2 weeks, the Russians advanced. When the trains finally moved again, they didn't take us to Auschwitz. They took us to a labor camp instead. It was terrible, but I survived. I survived because of those 2 weeks." She turned to the young man beside her. "This is my grandson," she said. "Daniel. He is alive because you and your friends destroyed those tracks. All of his future children and grandchildren will be alive because of what you did." Jimmy didn't know what to say. He had spent 30 years trying to make sense of the war, trying to understand whether the sacrifices had been worth it. And now, standing in front of this woman and her grandson, he finally had his answer. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Millions had died, and nothing could ever justify that horror. But it was something. It was proof that even in the darkest moments, even when all hope seemed lost, individual actions could make a difference. That every life saved was a victory, a light pushing back against the darkness. Jimmy embraced the woman, feeling her body shake with sobs that were 30 years in the coming, and when he finally let go, he looked up at the blue Jerusalem sky and said a silent prayer of thanks. The months following the railway mission brought changes that Jimmy could never have anticipated. As the war in Europe wound down, the focus shifted to the Pacific, where American forces were fighting a brutal island-hopping campaign toward Japan. There was talk of transferring experienced pilots to the Pacific Theater, and Jimmy found himself facing a choice he had never expected to make. One evening, Colonel Webb called him into his office. The old man looked tired, more tired than Jimmy had ever seen him, the weight of 4 years of war finally showing in every line of his face. "Lieutenant Hartwell," Webb began, "I've received orders that concern you. The brass wants to send our best pilots to the Pacific. They're planning something big, something that could end the war." Jimmy nodded slowly. He had heard the rumors, whispers about a secret weapon that would make all conventional warfare obsolete. He didn't know the details, didn't want to know, but he understood that the war was entering its final phase. "Sir, I've got to be honest with you," Jimmy said. "I'm not sure how much fight I've got left in me." Webb was silent for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised Jimmy more than anything that had happened in 4 years of combat. He smiled. "Son, I've been watching you since you first walked onto this base. You were green as grass, scared out of your mind, but you had something that can't be taught. You had heart, and I've watched that heart get tested over and over in ways that would break most men. But you're still here. You're still standing." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "The war is almost over. I can feel it in my bones. And when it ends, we're going to need men like you to help rebuild what's been destroyed. Not just buildings and bridges, but trust, faith, the belief that human beings can be better than what we've seen." Jimmy didn't know how to respond. He had spent so long focusing on survival that he had never allowed himself to think about what might come after. "I'm not ordering you to go to the Pacific," Webb continued. "That's not my call to make, but I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'm proud of what you've accomplished. You've saved more lives than you'll ever know. The transfer never came. Before the orders could be finalized, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war in the Pacific ended with a suddenness that left everyone reeling." Jimmy heard the news while sitting in the mess hall, surrounded by men who had spent years fighting and dying and wondering if it would ever end. The celebration that followed was muted, at least for the pilots who had seen too much. They drank and laughed and embraced each other, but beneath the surface there was a heaviness that wouldn't lift. They had won, but victory felt nothing like they had imagined it would. In the weeks that followed, Jimmy found himself thinking about all the men who hadn't lived to see this day. Tom Reeves, who had sacrificed himself over Poland so the others could complete their mission. The bomber crews who had been shot down over Hamburg and Berlin and Dresden. The young pilots who had arrived at the base full of hope and been carried away in body bags. He started writing their names in a notebook, trying to remember each one, to honor their sacrifice in some small way. The list grew longer than he expected, page after page of names that represented lives cut short, futures that would never be realized. Bobby found him one evening, sitting alone in the chapel, the notebook open on his lap. "How many?" Bobby asked, sliding into the pew beside him. 217, Jimmy replied. "That's just the ones I knew personally, the ones whose faces I can still remember." Bobby was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would stay with Jimmy for the rest of his life. "Every one of those names is a universe," Bobby said, "a whole world of possibilities that will never be. But the thing is, Jimmy, the worlds they saved are real. The children who will be born because their fathers came home, the discoveries that will be made, the art that will be created, the love that will be shared, all of that exists because these men gave everything they had." Jimmy looked at his friend, seeing not just the skilled pilot and loyal companion, but the philosopher and poet who had emerged from the crucible of war. "How do you make peace with it?" Jimmy asked. "The randomness of it all. Why some of us lived and others didn't." "I don't think you make peace with it," Bobby replied. "I think you learn to carry it. To let it make you better instead of bitter, to honor the dead by living fully, by making the most of the time they gave us." It wasn't an answer exactly, but it was the beginning of one. The process of demobilization was slower than anyone expected. Even with the war over, there were still missions to fly, patrols to maintain, a military infrastructure to wind down. Jimmy spent the autumn of 1945 in a strange limbo, neither civilian nor fully soldier, waiting for his discharge papers to come through. During this time he received a letter from Sarah that changed everything. "My darling Jimmy," she wrote, I have news that I hardly dare to put into words. I am pregnant. Our child will be born in the spring, God willing, and I cannot wait for you to come home and be a father." Jimmy read the letter a dozen times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. A child, his child, a new life emerging from the ashes of destruction. He applied for emergency leave and flew to England, arriving at Sarah's door on a cold November evening with nothing but his uniform and a heart full of hope. She opened the door, her face glowing with a happiness that made everything he had endured seem worthwhile. They were married 3 days later in a small ceremony, attended by a handful of friends and family. Sarah's parents, who had initially been skeptical of the American flyboy their daughter had fallen for, embraced Jimmy as their own. The wedding was simple but beautiful, a celebration of life and love in a world that had seen too much death. Their daughter was born in April of 1946, a beautiful girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. They named her Hope because that was what she represented to them. Hope for a better future, hope for a world where children would never have to know the horrors their parents had witnessed. But the scars of war didn't heal overnight. Jimmy struggled with nightmares, with sudden flashes of memory that would transport him back to the cockpit, back to the terror and the violence. Some nights he would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, reaching for a control stick that wasn't there. Sarah was patient and understanding, holding him through the dark hours, reminding him that he was safe, that the war was over, that he was home. Her love was an anchor that kept him from drifting into despair. The birth of his son, James Jr., in 1948 brought another wave of joy and responsibility. Jimmy threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he had brought to combat, determined to give his children the childhood he himself had lost. He played catch in the backyard, read bedtime stories, attended school plays and little league games. He tried to be present in a way that his own father, a distant and often absent man, had never been. But he couldn't escape the past entirely. Every year, on the anniversary of the Adlerhorst mission, he would grow quiet and withdrawn, lost in memories that couldn't be shared. Sarah learned to give him space on those days, to let him work through whatever demons were haunting him. One year, Hope, who was about 8 at the time, asked him why he was sad. Jimmy looked at his daughter, at her innocent face that had never known war or fear or loss, and he struggled to find words that she could understand. A long time ago, he finally said, Daddy had to do some very hard things, things that scared him very much, and sometimes he remembers those things and feels sad. But the bad things are over now, right? Hope asked. You don't have to do them anymore. That's right, sweetheart, Jimmy replied, pulling her into a hug. The bad things are over, and the only reason I could do them was because I knew I was fighting for something important, for a world where little girls like you could grow up safe and happy. Hope seemed satisfied with this explanation, and she ran off to play with her brother. But Jimmy sat there for a long time, thinking about the choices he had made and the price he had paid. The years passed, as years do, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Jimmy rose through the ranks at the Air Force Academy, eventually becoming one of the most respected instructors in its history. His students went on to fly in Korea and Vietnam, carrying with them the lessons he had taught about courage, skill, and the moral weight of military service. Bobby's electronics company grew into a major corporation, pioneering innovations in radar, communications, and eventually the emerging field of computing. He never forgot where he came from, establishing scholarship programs and mentoring young engineers from backgrounds similar to his own. The two friends made a point of reuniting every year, usually around the anniversary of their first mission together. They would spend a weekend fishing or golfing, reminiscing about old times and marveling at how much the world had changed. During one of these reunions, in 1963, Bobby revealed something that surprised Jimmy. I've been doing some digging, Bobby said, trying to find out what happened to the people we saved, the ones on those trains that got delayed because of our mission. And, Jimmy asked, his curiosity piqued. Bobby pulled out a thick folder filled with photographs and documents. I hired a researcher to track them down, Bobby explained. It took years, but we found hundreds of survivors. People who are alive today because those rail lines were destroyed. He opened the folder and began showing Jimmy the photographs, a doctor in New York who had developed a new treatment for childhood leukemia, a musician in Vienna whose symphonies were performed around the world, a farmer in Argentina who had built a community for displaced refugees, a grandmother in Australia surrounded by children and grandchildren who owed their existence to a few critical weeks of delay. Every one of these people, Bobby said, his voice thick with emotion, traces their survival back to what we did. And they've gone on to do incredible things, to save other lives, to create beauty, to build communities. It's like throwing a stone into a pond and watching the ripples spread outward forever. Jimmy looked at the photographs, at the faces of strangers who had become linked to him through the strange alchemy of war and survival. He thought about the men who had died to make this possible, about Tom Reeves and the others who had given everything so that these people could live. "Do you think they would be satisfied?" Jimmy asked. "The ones who didn't make it. Do you think they would feel like it was worth it?" Bobby considered the question for a long moment. "I think," he finally said, "that they would be proud, not of the killing or the destruction, but of the lives saved. The futures made possible, the children who will never have to know what we knew." They sat in silence after that, two old warriors contemplating the strange mathematics of sacrifice and salvation. The invitation to the ceremony in Israel, when it came in 1975, felt like a culmination of everything they had experienced. Jimmy was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of being honored for something that had cost so much. But Bobby insisted, and Sarah encouraged him, and in the end, he found himself on a plane to Jerusalem with his family by his side. The ceremony itself was overwhelming. Dignitaries and survivors, politicians and priests, all gathered to recognize the contribution of the American pilots who had disrupted the machinery of death. Jimmy sat in the front row, feeling out of place in his civilian clothes, surrounded by men and women who had suffered in ways he could barely imagine. When the speeches were over and the crowds began to disperse, that's when the woman approached him. The woman whose story would finally bring him peace. The technique that Jimmy and his fellow pilots pioneered over Adlerhorst became a closely guarded secret for decades after the war. It wasn't until the 1980s that the full details were declassified, revealing the incredible ingenuity and courage that had gone into developing and executing the Engine-off infiltration missions. Military historians now recognize the technique as one of the most innovative tactical developments of the Second World War, a perfect example of how lateral thinking and raw courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The lessons learned from those missions influenced the development of stealth technology, electronic countermeasures, and special operations doctrine for generations to come. But for Jimmy Hartwell, the technical details were never the point. What mattered was the human element, the men who had been willing to fly into the unknown with nothing but their skill and their faith to protect them, the men who had known that they might not come back and had gone anyway. He told their stories until the very end, at veterans' gatherings and school assemblies, in interviews with historians and documentarians. He spoke about Bobby Chen and Tom Reeves and Colonel Webb and all the others who had fought and died so that the world might be free. He never embellished, never dramatized, just told the truth as he remembered it and let the facts speak for themselves. Jimmy Hartwell died in 2003 at the age of 82. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including Bobby Chen, who had made the trip from California despite his own failing health. The eulogy was delivered by Daniel, the grandson of the woman Jimmy had met in Jerusalem, who had become a doctor specializing in trauma recovery. "He saved my grandmother's life," Daniel said, "and mine, and those of my children, not with a weapon, but with courage, not with violence, but with the willingness to sacrifice everything for a stranger he would never meet." That's the kind of hero Jimmy Hartwell was. That's the kind of hero we should all aspire to be. The secret that won the war wasn't a weapon or a technology. It was the human spirit, the capacity to find hope in the darkest moments and act on it even when success seemed impossible. It was the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, to risk everything for the chance to make the world a little bit better. That's why those American pilots were ordered to kill their engines over enemy territory, not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to do what needed to be done. And they did it, knowing the risks, understanding the costs, believing that some things are worth dying for. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as a footnote in military history, but as a testament to what human beings are capable of when they refuse to surrender to fear. The legacy of those missions continued to influence military thinking for generations. The principles they demonstrated, the importance of deception, of exploiting enemy weaknesses, of courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds, became fundamental to the development of special operations doctrine throughout the world. When stealth aircraft were finally developed decades later, the engineers who designed them acknowledged a debt to the engine-off pioneers of World War II. The idea that an aircraft could become invisible to radar, that silence could be a weapon, had its roots in the desperate improvisations of 1944. But for those who lived through it, the technical achievements were never the point. What mattered was the human story, the ordinary people who were asked to do extraordinary things and found within themselves the strength to respond. Jimmy Hartwell was one such person. Bobby Chen was another. And there were thousands more, young men and women from every corner of the Allied world, who set aside their fears and their doubts and their dreams of a peaceful life to fight against an evil that threatened to consume everything they loved. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were simply doing what needed to be done, paying the price that their generation was asked to pay. Many of them didn't survive to see the victory they helped to achieve. Many of those who did survive carried wounds, visible and invisible, that never fully healed. But their sacrifice made a difference. It preserved a world where freedom and dignity and hope remained possible. It gave future generations the chance to build something better, to learn from the mistakes of the past, to strive toward a future where such horrors would never be repeated. The next time you hear the sound of an aircraft engine, think about those young men who flew into silence, who traded the roar of power for the whisper of gliding wings, who trusted in physics and prayer and each other to bring them through. Think about the choices they made, the risks they took, the price they paid. Think about what it means to truly commit to something larger than yourself, to put your life on the line for principles that may seem abstract, but are actually the foundation of everything that makes life worth living. And remember that the battles we fight are not always the ones we choose, but how we fight them defines who we are. The story of the engine-off missions is ultimately a story about the power of human ingenuity and courage to overcome even the most formidable obstacles. It's a story about friendship and sacrifice, about the bonds forged in the crucible of war, about the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It's a story that deserves to be told again and again, to remind us of what we are capable of when we refuse to give up, when we insist on finding a way forward even when all paths seem blocked. In the silence of that long glide over enemy territory, those pilots discovered something essential about themselves and about humanity. They discovered that fear can be managed, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. They discovered that when people work together toward a common goal, they can achieve things that would be impossible alone. And they discovered that some things are worth dying for, but they are also worth living for. The freedom to think and speak and worship as we choose. The right to live without fear of persecution. The simple joys of family and friendship and love. These are the things that those young pilots were fighting for, even if they couldn't always put it into words. These are the things that made their sacrifice meaningful, that gave their struggle purpose, that transformed a collection of individual acts of courage into something larger and more lasting. The war ended, as all wars eventually do. The world rebuilt itself, slowly and imperfectly, learning to live with the scars of what had happened. The pilots who survived went home, started families, built careers and grew old, but they never forgot, and neither should we.